Economy in Law lecture series. I'm very pleased to present Professor Yugank Goyal, who is an assistant professor and assistant dean at the Jindal Global Law School in India, a new partner of the IUC as of this year. He is co-director of the Centre for the Center for the Intellectual Property Rights Studies, and he obtained his LLM in Law and Economics at Erasmus from this scholar from Europe at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, the Netherlands, the University of Hamburg, Germany, University of Manchester. He obtained his Bachelor of Technology and Mechanical Engineering from India, and his current areas of interest in which he has spoken and published are law and economics, new institutional economics, public policy, and intellectual property. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Andy, for this wonderful introduction. Couple of caveats before I begin. I know I studied in Europe, and I realize I speak very fast. So if I talk and it's incomprehensible, you don't see it because I'm talking very fast. Stop, okay? Maybe by gestures, ask me to go slow. There's no point like me talking without being convinced. Am I fast, by the way? Yeah. So I go slow. The second thing, this is an idea that I'm developing, and one of the aims of this lecture is to throw ideas at you, right? So you start thinking, and this is exactly what you should be doing at this age. Most Nobel Prize winners, at least in economics, have written their thesis when they were of your age, which got them Nobel Prizes, because then you have to live long to get Nobel Prizes. The third point, and that's probably the most important thing, is this. So Stephen Hawking, the celebrated physicist. So it's a story Stephen Hawking often gives to his class, and he says in one of the lectures of a scientist, when he was talking about cosmology, stars, suns, moons, after the lecture got over, there was an old woman at the end of the room, and she stood up and she said, "Whatever you're talking seems like rubbish, because what I know is that the whole Earth is standing on the back of a turtle, and it's not suspended in space." But the scientist was perplexed by this question. He said, "You know what? What do you think is the turtle standing on?" And the woman replied, "Well, you're very smart here, man, but the turtle is standing on another turtle, and its turtle is all the way down." So the idea is, I'm going to be building and developing turtles on turtles, right? And when we do a theoretical analysis, building on history, it's possible that we miss out certain pieces, or we reinterpret history in a different way. So I want you to be creative and innovative enough to open your minds and think about it in the manner I'm proposing. Second, because this is a work in progress, any comments or suggestions from your side would be most welcome. Right. So let me begin the talk by asking all of you, how many of you been to India? Alright. Very few. Alright. I'm sure you must have seen Slumdog Millionaire. Have you seen it? Yes. Most of you have. Alright. When you think about India, or when you think about an Indian street, let's say a street which has like cars and everything, the first impression that comes in your mind is probably chaos, right? You have everything on the street. You have pedestrians, you have cars, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, you even have animals. You have almost anything that can walk, that has legs except chairs and tables on the image. Sometimes you get chairs and tables also. This chaotic environment that exists in India exists alongside a phenomenal growth story as far as economy or finance is concerned. So we are poised at around 8 to 9% growth. We are shining, if I use the word, stupefying the whole world, how China and India are probably the backbone of economic growth around the world. All of this is true, but it all comes with a number of ironies, with a number of paradoxes. So, just 100 kilometers off Delhi, you would find Africa-like poverty, or from Bangalore, whereas cities like Delhi and Bangalore would give you a picture of the most glittering, high-tech towns that ever have existed on the surface of the earth. While I speak, around 1,000 children will die of diarrhea today itself in India. Around 47% of children born in India have high rates of malnourishment, and 47% of children means around 17 or 18% of population and you know the population is 1.21 billion. So it's a huge number. The poverty rates in India are extremely high, and they are the logic by which we define poverty is if you are able to earn $1.25 US dollars in one day or more, you are not poor. And now, so people earning below $1.25 per day is close to 45% in India, which is somewhere around 500 billion, right? All this at 9% growth rate, which is spectacular. All this with people like Lakshmi Mittal, who folks often talk about as probably the richest people in the world. And so therefore this irony and this paradox exists. I don't know if you've heard about Arvind Adiga, who wrote very recently a book called White Tiger, which won the Booker's Prize as well. And he very starkly and very interestingly pictures this paradox. Now this is what we read in newspapers. So what underlies all of this that I'm talking about is something much more complex. In India, as of now, it's the 9th largest economy in the world, and it's the 4th largest economy by purchasing power parity. So by GDP it's 9th largest, by purchasing power parity it's 4th largest, which is like 4th largest economy in the world. But over 90% of the workforce is employed in informal businesses. Now informal businesses or unorganized sector is a sector which is not recognized by the government. So they don't pay taxes, they are not registered. Whatever money they earn is purely informal in nature. Because they do not have any registration, they cannot apply for a bank loan, they cannot get money. And I'm making classic Hernando de Soto's argument, as he makes in his book, The Other Path and the Mystery of Capital. 90% of the population is employed in unorganized sector. All these big Fortune 500 companies that you hear about in India, it's just 10% of the population which is working there. I'm including agriculture in this. Second, this informal economy is for the most part driven entirely on the basis of family and kinship ties. So, informal rules and informal relational contracts crowd out the formal contracting mechanisms that exist in the organized business sector. Third, most Indian businesses are patrilineal or patrimonial in character. There is a concept called Hindu undivided family. Most wealth in Indian businesses are concentrated in the family itself. And these families have a recognition in the constitution. So they do not follow the usual corporate governance norms, nor do they follow the partnership norms, but they still, and they only follow informal norms of filial and family ties. But around the world, this is the only country where such family obligated businesses are recognized as a separate entity. And this forms largely 60% of the total informal sector that is employed. And then there are a number of other things which the shadow economy. The shadow economy means the black money on which citizens do not pay tax is close to 26% of the gross domestic product. 26% of GDP is the amount of money which is probably up there inside the trunks of the bed or in the wallets on which tax is not paid. Because it is unrecognized and it is shadow, it is never interested in tax, and because it doesn't go into the bank, people cannot borrow money out of that money, which is 26% of GDP, which is very high. India has over 10 judges per million of population. 10 judges per million. In US, this figure is close to 110. The point that I'm trying to make is, although India has very high level of judicial pendencies and court delays, most trials do not even go to the court. They are solved informally at the local level itself. For a variety of reasons. One, of course, is because it's a classic chicken and egg story, that because the delays and pendencies are so long, therefore there is no incentive to go and file the case in the court. A classic scene, so for example, if a car hits another car on Indian street, it's a very, normally what you would see is this. Both the drivers will come out, they will start fighting, they will start quarreling. Everybody else who's on the street will come together, they try to mediate whatever is happening. They try to tell them, okay, how much money you have in your pocket, how much money you have in your pocket. They settle that out there. It was your mistake, you were not in the line, you were overtaken, you were off everything on the street, and they settled there. Maybe one party is disadvantaged than the other, but chances are that this will never go to the court. And unless of course if there is a accidental death or something, because then it becomes a major problem. India, so basically very few disputes go to the court. India has a very diluted rule of law society. And in order to explain why I say, and I'm making a big statement, I know, and I can defend it in any forum. The reason why I'm saying this is because Indian polities or Indian state in general is considered to be relatively weak. When I say weak, what I mean is this. India is the largest democracy in the world. I mean, absolutely. But just like sausage making, the closer you get to the democracy, the more you realize it's sort of not what it looks like from the outside. Around 1/4 of parliamentarians have criminal cases against them. I'm trying to give you a picture which exists, despite the fact that India is definitely poised at a very high, phenomenal economic growth, which is indeed happening. And we, all of us, are part of that generation which see both of these things happening side by side. So 1/3 of them have criminal cases against them. Most of them have been elected on the basis of racial or caste lines. Many of them are not educated, let alone being a graduate. And Indian political system is hugely corrupt. It is, and this is something I don't even need to talk about because you know and you have well read in the newspapers that India is indeed a corrupt country by the standards of Transparency International. Now, all of this may beg a question as to why is it that both growth and underdevelopment in this fashion exist or mutually coexist in India, despite the fact that India was ruled for around 200 years by a country which had probably one of the most robust legal institutions which they imported and transplanted on India. So in 1947, when Britishers left India, they gave India the kind of parliamentary democracy that Britain itself has. They gave India the laws, the penal codes that Britishers themselves had, and therefore they tried to make institutions in India close to what existed in Britain itself. Even then, after 60 years of independence, we have around 70% literacy rate, which is less than the world average of 84%. We have a very high gender disparate society where, let's say, the female literacy is around 65%, male literacy is 84%. And we have informal businesses occupying a lion's share in the employment sector. So 90% of people are employed in informal businesses. Most of them don't even go to the courts and take their cases. And high growth rate coexists along with shadow economy of 26% of people. All this is very perplexing. And so when we look at why is this that countries like India, and so okay, one important thing is my lecture is focusing on India, but by and large, these analogies that I am drawing would be similar to any other developing country which has been colonized for a long time. Although we cannot import the second half of my lecture to any other country because that particularly rests on history of India. So this is very perplexing, right? The way India has become itself, has transformed itself into what it has, is very perplexing. And so when I decided to think about why is it we are the way we are, I realized that we cannot know why we are the way we are unless we know who we were in the past. This idea was an influence on me by reading literature on what we now call as New Institutional Economics. New Institutional Economics, I realize you have just joined this LLM course, which is like just 2 weeks old. So I'm sure you will learn about New Institutional Economics in the forthcoming semesters, in one way or the other. But to give you a brief background of what it basically entails is the following. It's an old idea. Douglas North particularly is a scholar, economic historian who got a Nobel Prize in 1993 in economics, who has influenced me particularly. Let me talk about institutions by building another thought experiment. Societies across history have diverged from how it began. So let's say we all were tribal societies when humankind, let's say 50,000 years ago, when we were all basically trying to transform biologically into Homo sapiens. 10,000 years ago, we all became approximately, we came to know what is agriculture. We started growing food crops and eating them. Then by 5,000 years ago, approximately, the tribal society started getting themselves civilized. Different places in the world have then taken a different route altogether in order to develop themselves into a very different society. So society in Italy, for example, is very different from society in India, let's say. Now this seems natural because obviously there are a lot of geographical and biological considerations that need to come into it. However, the problem is this. In the wake of modern information technological systems, when institutions, or let me use the word institutions a little later, when structures of societies can be borrowed from one part to the other, or laws can be simply imported from point A to point B, why do we still find societies diverging? Why do, in spite of similar policies, some countries are rich and many of them are poor? And why those which are poor in relatively different manner? So some of them have Africa-style poverty, the other ones will have Latin American poverty. And of course there's a separate third group of poor countries which is in South Asia. Productivity, so neoclassical theory talks about rational choice theory. And they talk about you can increase productivity. And you can increase productivity by human capital or physical capital. So as long as you can import human and physical capital, your productivity will increase, and that will aid to the development of the society in general from economic point of view. Now that's perfectly fine. If you lack physical capital, foreign investment can take place. If you lack social capital, investment in education can take place. Overall, investments in different kinds of capitals can help countries begin at a common starting point. And when they have enough capital to begin with, they can hope to reach certain level of productivity. But that is not seen in this world. Some countries have been more productive, some countries have not been. And therefore this perplexing idea of why some countries have different level of productivity and why some countries do not have it lies in the fallacy of the neoclassical economic theory itself. So neoclassical economic theory rests on one of the strongest assumptions of information being costlessly transferred from one point to the other, or information symmetry existing in the market. Which means, if you are a buyer and I am a seller, both of us know about the product entirely. Well, that normally doesn't happen, because there is some part of information that the buyer normally has, that the seller has more than what the buyer will have. Let's talk about, let's say, second-hand car market, which George Akerlof talked about in the 1970s, and because of which he got a Nobel Prize in 2002. He said, I am a seller of a second-hand car market, a second-hand car, and I know about the problems in the car much more than the buyer. So the price that I will impose on the buyer will always be in consideration of the quality of the product that I am selling. Because the buyer will never know of all of the entire information of the car, he would try to deflate that price or bring down that price. So if I say I want to sell this car at 10,000 euros, the buyer will never believe me. And he will say, I don't want to buy this car at more than 8,000 euros. So therefore this information asymmetry that exists in the market does not allow the second-hand car market to develop. And that is true in many cases across the world. Secondly, information transplants from one society to the other will always, in the same way, have some leakages. I want to call them leakages because societies will not be able to employ information symmetrically at 2 points in time or at 2 points in places. So, if I develop certain rules and regulations and I transplant these rules and regulations in a different country, it is not necessary that the solution that will emerge out of this will be efficient, because we work in a world of positive transaction cost. Now, transaction cost is a different. So transaction cost is the cost of transaction. So if I go and buy, let's say, pizza from the market, the cost of transaction is probably the search cost. Where do I want to go and buy pizza from? The transaction cost would be, let's say the price, the time that I spend in buying pizza. Let's say 10 minutes, 20 minutes. That's the transaction cost. Because the world exists in positive transaction costs, therefore the information that travels around the world is never 100%. There is always a leakage of information. So when North was discussing productivity, he said that these productivity models focus too much on information symmetry, which does not exist at all. And because information symmetry does not exist, institutions do not develop. And this is how he defines institutions. Institutions are basically the rules of the game in society. They're blankly stated, they're just rules of the game. So if I want to go purchase a pizza, if I want to let's say worship certain god, let's say I want to greet a stranger in the street, all of these are bound by institutions. So institutions can therefore be formal as well as informal. Formal institutions are legal institutions in general. Legal institutions are laws. So our laws are all formal institutions. The statutes, the constitutions, they are all formal institutions. Whatever does not follow in the law, but we still do, is informal in nature. So for example, if one of your mobile phone rings, you would want to go out and talk to the person, or maybe switch it off. There is no law as such, but you would still do it. This is an informal institution. When you're walking on the street, you would want to wear clothes which you think follow certain norms of the society. That's again informal institution. The way societies develop is therefore closely related to both formal and informal institutions. And unless you understand informal institutions properly, there is no way that you can import formal legal institutions on the society and expect that results will emerge in the way you expect. So for example, if I have the property law in India and property law in UK can very well be the same, but the results will always be different because informal institutions that govern human relationships in India is different from informal institutions that govern relationships in English or American society. Now so far, it looks a very general and theoretical framework. Let me try to make it a little more simple. When legal rules always evolved after informal institutions evolved. When tribal societies existed, they always had an informal means by way of which they could transact with each other. These transactions were not guided by a certain rule book, but they were guided by certain norms, conventions, the traditional codes of conduct that these societies had developed over a period of time. When these code of conducts were being developed, we were talking about tribes which were pretty close in terms of their kins. So there is a small tribe of around, let's say, 100 people in this area. There is another tribe, let's say 100 kilometers away, and they have their own social norms which they follow. Both of these tribes may have different social norms, and therefore the transaction will be limited in these tribes itself. However, when the transaction increases, when transaction increases or transaction scope increases from one society to the other, there is a difference in the norms that emerges. And in order to bypass those social norms, formal institutions evolve. So, formal institutions therefore are a result of the cost of the transaction between two different societies that have different social norms, that have different informal institutions. Let me try to make this even simpler. Let's assume there is no game called football. Let's say there is no game like soccer. And there's a group of people who are wanting to play this game, and there's a ball. And they just decide that let's just play a game in a manner so that we hit the ball only by our foot. There are no rules as such which are defined. The first informal institution that will develop out of such a game is that you cannot hit the other person while doing it. You have to do it without hitting the other person. When you do this, you develop a game. After which you realize, because this generates interest, let us define rules and regulations. These rules and regulations are therefore imposed by a third party, and therefore enforcement of these rules and regulations becomes very important. Notice that for informal institutions, enforcement is not necessarily a very important criteria. Enforcement takes place, or let me call it, it's an important criteria, but it is not governed by a third party. So enforcement is inherent in nature. So let's say if in a tribe, one person doesn't follow the norms of that tribe, then probably the leader of the tribe would penalize that person or excommunicate this person from the community or the tribe. These kind of informal institutional enforcement are different from formal legal institutional enforcements which come in the form of penalties, let's say by the state. So when the state emerged, in order to reduce the transaction cost between two societies which have different social norms, there was a formal legal institution that evolved through the centuries, which helped societies govern their relations, govern their transactions on the basis of those formal legal institutions. And so far, the story was good. The formal legal institutions, therefore, are a byproduct of informal institutions that societies have. So, common law emerged in England and countries which England colonized, particularly in England, as a byproduct of precedence-based laws, which took place since time immemorial, since last 1000 years. Alternatively, laws in different other countries emerged as a result of the social norms that these countries had. I'm talking about the countries which were not organized, where these laws emerged evolutionarily from the informal institutions that existed. Countries like India had a very different set of informal institutions in place, a very different. And so when we were colonized by Britishers, imposition of formal institutions, of formal laws, of statutes, of constitutions, of acts by Britishers on a society which had very different informal institution created a mismatch. And this mismatch is something that we are still grappling with. I will give you an example from a different geographical location, Melanesia. Melanesian islands are Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands. Papua New Guinea is perhaps the most diverse country in the entire world. It's a small population, very small country, and they have close to 900 languages. Solomon Island themselves have, Solomon Island is close to 500,000 people, and they have more than 60 languages, and they are all incomprehensible entirely, right? They have their own social norms. The way the social norms were governed before Australians invaded or colonized these places were as follows. What they would do is this. They would have a big man, we call it big man because there is no better translation, elected by a group of tribal people who would ensure that whatever produce from agriculture or from animal husbandry is equally distributed among the people. Big man is not hereditary in nature, never used to be hereditary, nor would big man be elected on the basis of politics as we now see. It used to be purely on the basis of kinship as well as mutual consensus. When Australians left in 1970s and imposed Westminster-style governments in these islands, the result was a chaos. They never had any property system, and because there was no property system, investment in these countries was extremely difficult, foreign investment. In order to buy a certain area of land to set up a factory or an industry or let's say drill oil, they had to individually talk to all tribal people who owned that piece of land, and all of these people had a spiritual belongingness to that piece of land and not necessarily monetary. Of course, corruption sort of developed in this situation when person who was appointed by the Westminster style government was paid money by these people and everything. Essentially, what Australians failed to analyze or see in 1970s when they gave them independence is that these countries or these islands, these tribes are governed by millions of social norms, and they cannot impose a different set of legal institutions on these informal institutions, because the result will not be evolutionary in nature. It will be a layer over another layer, and this, without removing the first layer, you will not get efficient outcomes. So your institutions can therefore both be formal and informal. They can both be creative and evolutionary. Let me now therefore come back to import this idea of institutional economics in what happened in India or Indian subcontinent. So I'm going to be talking very briefly and broadly about the historical context in which I want to place this study. And I would begin with, let's say, around 5th century BC, when Indian tribes actually started. So the theory which goes in history is this, that from Central Asia there was a tribe which we now call as Aryans or Aryans. They migrated east and west. The guys who went into east came towards Indo-Gangetic plain near the northern part of India. People who were still living there were called Dasas, and they, in the tribal conflict, drove them down south. This is usually the accepted theory. This has, although it comes with a number of caveats, but this is the usually accepted theories. The scriptures that evolved after this were not necessarily religious in nature. So, for example, Hindu as a word, as a term, does not exist in any of the religious scriptures. It comes out of the word called Indus. Indus is the name of the river that flows in Pakistan. And Indus in Sanskrit used to be called as Sindhu. Because Persians cannot pronounce Sir, and they pronounce Sir as Her, they used to call these people who are living beyond Indus as Hindu. And this is how the word Hindu itself came into being. So the idea is that Hindi or Hindu was basically not a development of religion, but a development of the way of life these tribes originated with. One of the important emergence during this period was the emergence of caste. These castes are further divided into varnas, which are basically major castes, and jatis, which are subcastes. The varnas are the major castes, which are four in nature. These are Sanskrit terms: Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. So Brahmins are at the top of the social pyramid, if I want to call it pyramid, and they are the guardians of religion and spirituality. Kshatriyas are the warrior communities, the warrior class who fight in the wars. Vaishyas are the community of traders and merchants, and Shudras are the communities of everybody else who exists in this world. Therefore, anything that is not done by these three will be done by Shudra. Clearly enough, over a period of time, Shudras came to be classified as lower castes. This caste system in India, which emerged close to when the medieval state emerged in India, was a very important divergence of India from other countries in the world where state emergence never took place on the lines as it took place in India. And in order to understand what is happening in India today, it is important to understand what happened in India back then. Now, these castes were divided in a very strict watertight compartments. When I say watertight compartments, these I mean strictly from the point of view of occupation. There are obviously divergences. So there are some people who would work for both the occupation of both merchants as well as warriors. But by and large, these castes gave a structure to the society both in terms of economy as well as in terms of spiritualism. When I talk about Brahmins were the custodians of the religion itself. So the way sociologists, including Max Weber and Emily Durkheim, who have studied India, particularly Weber, have described Hindu religion it's a very mystic religion in nature, which means that in essence, Hindus believe that there is the sole purpose of life is to immerse oneself out of the real world into what we call, or what Hindus call, Brahma, which is the soul truth. Which means whatever we see in reality is whatever we see in this world is basically an illusion, and whatever exists in the real world is not material. Whatever material that exists in this world does not matter in the long run. What matters in the long run is the spiritual association of one's soul with what we call as or Brahma. Now this is spiritual discussion, but it had far-reaching implications back when this theory, which came from Rig Veda, emerged. The implications came in the following manner. Whatever you do, it does not matter, because at the end of the day, the sole purpose for which you are in this world is moksha. Moksha is another word let me call another word, nirvana. So you attain peace, you purge yourself from this world by attaining moksha, and moksha cannot be attained in this life, it exists in the life after death. Therefore, whatever you do in this life is designed by the theory of karma. If you are born a Brahmin, you are supposed to work for the work that is defined for Brahmins, which means you're supposed to work you have to read scriptures, you have to ensure that rituals and religious practices in each and everybody's life are followed to the minutest details. If you're born a Kshatriya, then your sole purpose is to probably join army so that kings or warrior classes can help defend their own country. If you're born a Vaishya, then you are probably better off doing any trading job or any manufacturing job, which will so basically earning money at that level. And if you're born a Shudra, you will do pretty much everything else. The way in which Brahmins divided the society, or I should not say Brahmins, the way in which the society was divided was therefore strict occupational segmentation. In addition, marriages were also, inter-caste marriages were also forbidden. And therefore, if I am born a Brahmin, or if I am born a Vaishya, or if I am born in a particular caste, I would want to carry on whatever I am doing in this. And because of this, there was a relatively less amount of entrepreneurial abilities to cross-navigate between the castes. Now these things do not exist in the same strict fashion today as they used to exist before. However, we still see the underpinnings of this even now. So let me go one by one. And then there is one more important thing. When Brahmins undertook the supremacy of the spiritual world onto themselves, they ensured that the legitimacy of the ruler or the kingdom rests not with the king but with the Brahmins. So the king is definitely the head of the state, but in order to legitimize the king's own position and king's action, be it waging war or be it taxing certain sector of the economy, will have to come by approval from certain priests that used to be instrumental in carving out policies for the state. This is very important to know because in India, therefore, historically, the ruling class was never the default ruling class. The ruling class was warrior class, which was Kshatriya. However, the policy making was always vetted or approved by the Brahmins, which always had a supremacy over the warrior class. This is relatively different from the way it emerged in Europe, as far as Europe is concerned in the form of church, because church was more of a centralized piece and had a central government in the first place. Was acting as a central quasi-government in the first place. In India, it never happened. The Brahmins were dispersed across communities and they had different norms that they followed. And therefore, the rule of law was never centralized in India throughout centuries. Interestingly, the political power in India was therefore never so strong across histories compared to the political powers that we see, for example, in China. In China, for example, the Qin dynasty, Han dynasty or Zhao dynasty had a very strong central presence, and they ensured and they undermined the social stability so they ensured the political stability at the cost of social stability. Therefore, across China, even though dialects differ, the language is pretty much the same, even though geographically it is much bigger than India. In India, however, that never took place because central power was never vested in totality with the rulers themselves. The biggest kingdom before 1947 that India had was in around 3rd century BC under the Mauryan Empire, and even that lasted somewhere around 130 years. The fact that Indians could not consolidate the empire entirely for a long period of time basically is an evidence to the fact that political power in India was never concentrated in the first place since 5th century BC or since the concept of state emerged. The second most important political power that emerged was in 5th century AD, which was again for a very short period of time. And then later on, there was Muslim invaders from Afghanistan and modern Turkey. And these tried to consolidate power. Even though their existence on Indian soil politically was strong, they were never able to penetrate deeply the social structures that were prevalent in India throughout history. And these social structures were not necessarily a result of caste system, but also a result of the social norms that were byproducts of caste systems, or which existed alongside caste systems. So, over a period of time, the strong political power of India, which was vested with the rulers, used to always get weakened by either internal conflicts or segmentary population that were in different parts of the country, who tried to gain power over the other. Therefore, India throughout history has been constantly under a state of disunity or anarchy as far as politics is concerned. At the same time, it was an extremely stable society as far as communities is concerned. So at political level, there was a huge amount of anarchy and discontinuity in Indian historical spectrum. At social level, there was a strict occupational, religious as well as caste segmentary lineages that were prevalent, and that lent a stability to the society. Which means Indian society actually never bothered who was ruling them at any point of time, because their social structure was so intact and held cohesively by the norms that these societies had. This is the reason as to why most invaders were able to exert some influences, but only to a certain extent. Throughout the last 2.5 centuries, India has been invaded by a number of foreign invaders, as well as there have been strifes and discontinuous warfares amongst Indian tribal chief clans, as well as kingdoms and empires, small non-uniform empires. But at the same time, the social structure remained the same as it used to be. This stability to social structure is a key. Therefore, the stability of social structure and instability of political structure is a key to understand what goes in India, even while we speak. And one more important thing, Indians never had long history of warfares, continuous warfares, in order to establish strong kingdoms, like for example, which took place in China particularly. And I'm talking about China more often because it's often contrasted today when an investment. So I was in Berlin just last week, and Professor Peter Dussel from Austrian National University is working on energy economics in South Asia. And he talks to me and he says that if Shell, let's say, or British Petroleum wants to invest in China, it's relatively very easy for them, because on phone calls, the Chinese government can tell them, well, yes, if you want to invest, we'll give you the place, and we will help you facilitate this investment. Whereas in India, in order to buy a tract of land, even Indian companies have to undergo a series of legislation or consensual efforts across a number of months or sometimes years, so as to finalize that yes, this is what we want to do, which is something. So recently it happened with one of the biggest Indian multinational giants called Tata. The reason is because Indian democracy, even though it's pluralistic in nature, has always given society's stability a very strong, or political instability a very strong weightage compared to the political stability in China. So China has always been able to preserve strong central government, probably at the cost of probably at the cost of society. India, on the other hand, has always been able to preserve a strong sense of social stability at the cost of political stability. So therefore, political stability in India never mattered to the society across a period of time. Which is why today in India, we do not see any structural reasons for it not to be a dictatorship. It is multi-ethnic, it is multilingual. We're close to around 1600 languages. I mean, 18 languages are official languages, but if I include all the dialects, number of them. If you travel to India, after every 200 kilometers, probably you will see everything changing. The language, the food, the dress, everything, almost everything. The culture itself. And because of these changes, India emerges as a society of a million new things. India has a huge amount of poverty. India has a number of issues, socio-economic issues that it grapples with every day. But at the same time, there has never been any effort to overthrow the government like it has happened probably in other parts of the world which face similar issues, let's say Pakistan or Bangladesh or even Latin America. The complacency against the political power in India is a result of deep-rooted institutional social norms that we have imbibed in ourselves throughout the last 2.5 millennia. And this is not necessarily a result of caste system, but also, as I said, the social norms that came along with it. So when Britishers came and they imposed Western-style governments on India, although it did help a lot in terms of, and which is why probably pretty much, 1947, probably India was the biggest consolidated faction of an empire that we saw after 3rd century BC. All of small nations that existed in India became one. And because of the common, let's say, Indian Penal Code, common law of property, we were able to attract investment, particularly in the last 20 years, but have been progressing by far in a very impressive way. However, even though the inequality, the gap between inequality which has been rising in India in the previous years has not been able, even though it is chaotic in nature, has not reached the critical threshold of overthrowing the government, because institutionally or socially we have been pretty much stable organization. And let me tell you why this, and let me tell you an example of how this happens. In India, growth in businesses take place in clusters. This is not very different from several other countries in the world too, but it is particularly stark in India. The second largest diamond market in the world after Antwerp is Surat. Surat is a city in India. So, after Antwerp, the largest amount of diamonds which are cut and polished takes place in India. And almost the entire community which works on diamond comes from a single caste, almost the entire. There is hardly any paperwork done. All disputes are managed informally by people themselves. And this is close to what Abner Reif in his 1989 paper on Maghrebi traders in Mediterranean wrote. These institutions, these societies or these communities have developed institutional and informal norms to deal with disputes. There are certain clusters of development of, let's say, in Tamil Nadu, Tirupur for textiles, Ahmedabad, certain community working in textile. In Moradabad, another city, certain community working on glass. There is another city in which Aligarh, for example, certain community only which works in the manufacture of locks, and it exports many of them. The manufacturing, therefore, is not very strictly, but by and large is confined to a particular caste. And even though most of it takes place informal in nature, when I say informal, basically no access to bank loans, no access to registration, no tax, it is working phenomenally well. The reason why it is working phenomenally well is because these institutional norms that India had developed over the period of last several centuries has ensured and given certainty to the transactions. And therefore, that is why what Douglas North calls the reason why institutions develop is to impart certainty to human interaction. Imagine how it would be if we are all interacting, if we are all transacting amongst different goods. So you sell something, I sell something, and we all transact. However, there is no certainty that you will fulfill your promise. So you tell me that some of your goods are coming from Venice and they are out in the sea, and you will be able to give me the money, let's say after 3 months, and you ask credit. Unless I have an institutional manner in which I can be certain that my money or my credit is safe with you, I will not do it. Either the state should provide either the state should enforce that promises be kept, these contractual mechanisms be kept, or communities themselves evolve informal means of institutions, informal means of contracting by way of which they do. Across history, it is the communities which have done it. When the transactions have increased, complexities have increased, the third party form of state has come into the picture. In India, the problem in India is even though the third party has come into the picture, people still do not follow the mandate of the third party, which is the state, but would rather follow the institutions developed amongst the normative societies, because social norms or informal institutions are perhaps cheaper extensions of formal institutions. And so this is the idea that I want to develop. As long as formal laws or formal legal institutions are costlier than informal legal institutions or informal social norms, people will never resort to legal institutions. They will want to transact in the broad parameter of their own social norms. And this is exactly what is happening in India. These clusters, 90% of people working in informal sectors, the growth purely based on clusters is a result of people relying on informal legal institutions more than legal institutions. Which is why 26% of GDP is shadow economy or black money. These people do not have access to bank loans. They don't want to show any money or any profits that they have that they normally earn at the end of the day to the government, because they are not using the government any which ways. They are trying to resort to credit by informal institutions. So for example, I am of a particular community. I know this particular community will help me, and they will normally fulfill the promises that they make. I will transact with that community only, and therefore these communitarian segmentary lineages that have developed in the economy of India through clusters is deeply rooted in the fundamental institutions that India has seen in the last 2.5 centuries. That is why, even though in the last 60 years we have evolved modern set of formal legal institutions as a gift from Britishers, we are still not able to fully utilize or capture the essence of it. On the streets, we have laws and bylaws that we have to follow certain traffic regulations, but many times we don't. The cost of following law, as long as the cost of following legal institution is higher than not following it, people will not follow it. What will people follow then? People will follow informal institutions. People will follow the social norms. And the thesis is, India has developed, the social norms in India have deeply have been deeply rooted in the structure which has been given to it across last 2.5 centuries by the way caste system and social segmentation evolved in a very organized and an organic manner. And there is one more important thing. When Britishers, today India has around 70-75% literacy rate, but when Britishers granted us independence in 1947, our literacy was close to 12%, which is extremely low. The reason why India has historically been less literate than many other countries in the world is also probably rooted. I mean, again, all the ideas that I'm throwing have exceptions aside, caveats aside, is also probably because of the caste system that emerged. When Brahmins had a monopoly, and interestingly, we'll also see that very little of Indian history is chronicle, is written compared to, let's say, Chinese history. We have hardly any evidence except the edicts written on the rock pillars in Ashoka times, or some of the foreign visitors like Megasthenes or Yun Sang, who were the foreign visitors from China who came to India, saw what India is, and then wrote about India. We have very little account of what our social structure used to be, and most of them are deduced from the religious scriptures as well as from the accounts of what foreigners have written about us. The propensity of Indians to write or to engage in written work less is a result of the monopoly of written work by one particular sect or by one particular caste called Brahmins. The Brahmins were basically the leaders of thought, learning, of teaching, education, and everything. And they ensure that this restricts only to their own community. For as long as it happened throughout for 2.5 million years, literacy rate in India was therefore comparably much lower. There was a very small section of society that had access to Brahminical readings, and most of this learnings was transferred to the next generation by way of verbal communication rather than written pieces of scriptures. So we have a number of scriptures, but at the same time, historically India never had a culture of chronicling history or chronicling whatever is happening in the society, which is the result of what happened until 1947, when education was largely neglected by the social structure of India. Now, having said all this, let me conclude by proposing this as an idea. What happens in most societies in the world today, like the example that I gave you about Melanesian societies in Solomon Islands and other places, can therefore be modeled on the basis of incentives. One way to model incentive structure, how do you give incentives to people to work in one manner and not the other, is to follow the neoclassical economic models. Well, they are all rational, they are all wealth maximizing individuals, and therefore they will follow. If you change laws, people will change. There is another idea. So this is an idea that probably is keeping capital or money at the same piece. So Marx would be one person who would propose this idea. On the other hand, Weber or Durkheim would propose the idea that no, it's not money or it's not rational choice particularly that governs behavior or that governs society. It's much more than that. It's probably religion or social norms that govern societies. These social norms, once you start including social norms into the larger framework of neoclassical model of economics, you will suddenly see that pieces and dots are connected. And this is true not only in the case with India but also the case with China or Europe. I mean, Timur Kuran, who teaches in Duke, has done exactly the same study for why institutions develop the way they develop in Middle East. Fukuyama has done it for China as well. North himself has done it for US and Europe. The point that they're trying to make is that informal institutions hold a key to understanding how societies evolve. And if you want the societies to evolve in one manner, then you have to focus on how to create legal institutions that are cheaper extensions of informal institutions. I will be able to make it further clearer if I receive more questions, because as I said, these ideas would definitely be not as precise and crystallized as they appear to me probably, because this is an idea that I'm developing. There's a theory which is being developed around the world. How economic history can can help itself by lending issues and concepts from new institutional economics. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have, and probably engage more discussions and take some suggestions from the case studies. Thank you so much.
Basically, the only idea you explained us is that actually, yeah, formal institutions can work if they're cheaper than informal.
Right.
That's what you said. So what do you mean by cheap?
Right.
Is cheapness related only to the cost, or is there something more social involved in the idea of cheapness? I mean,
Right. So the way I define the cost structure in the entire model is by way of transaction cost. And I borrow the concept of transaction cost from Donald Coase. So what Coase said was that, let's say, so I'll give you I'm sure many of you would know what Coase said, but I'll just give an example of what, let's say I'm playing a guitar in this room and you are studying in the other room and you have an exam tomorrow. So you come to me and you say, you know what, I have to study, can you stop playing the guitar? And I'll say, no, I can't because I want to play the guitar, I have a concert tomorrow. So then you tell me, you know what, I'll give you 200 euros, can you stop it? If the worth of playing guitar is more than 200 euros for me, I will not stop it. I will say, no, I want 300. If the worth of studying for you is 300, then you will give 300. And the bargain will take place, right? So what Coase said is, if you give me 300 euros and I'm happy with it, then silence is the efficient solution. Silence, basically no guitar is the efficient solution. And he said, efficient solution will always emerge if the bargaining is costless, if we can talk to each other costlessly. However, let's say I'm Berlusconi, and you want certain policy to be implemented in Italy. And let's say you fall in that interest group that I come from, for you the bargaining may not be costless, because you have to, in order to reach me itself, you have to spend a lot of resources, effort, time, money, everything. Because of this, there is a transaction cost, and therefore it is possible that efficient solution will not emerge. Efficient solution will not emerge because there is a transaction cost, and this transaction cost will forbid you from undertaking that transaction in the first place. So by cheaper legal institutions, I mean institutions that reduce transaction costs. I'll give you an example. Let's say the cost of, I want to start a business, I want to set up a shop. Let's say I want to set up a barber's shop. I know how to cut people's hair, let's say I'm good at it. If I have to go through a number of government offices and municipalities to get my licenses, then the transaction cost is high, right? So I will not do it because the legal institution is very costly in that sense. So what I'll do is I'll probably ask my friend or my father, my uncle, can you lend me some money? I will ask a friend of mine, can you rent me a house? And I will start doing the job. When the policeman comes and tells me that what is the registration number of your shop, I will simply bribe him. And I'm happy bribing him as long as the money that I give him for the bribe is less than the money that I earn, right? So this is how informal economy will develop. Interestingly, 90% of Indian workforce exactly works like this. So they sit on the street. For those of you who have been to India, they sit on the street, they sell whatever goods they want to sell, and when the policeman comes, they bribe him. These people are unable to follow the legal institution because they're costly, right? And that will always happen because they will follow social norms because social norms are facilitating them to do what they want to do.
I see the point, but so what I would react is that the actors that you assume are within society are very homo economicus. I mean, simply people motivated by profit in a way.
Right.
So that's the only thing that matters.
In my example, yes.
So what about behavioral economics, for example?
You're absolutely right. The example that I gave.
There are different reasons for the way people act.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The example that I gave was about opening a shop, and therefore these actors are essentially homo economicus in nature. But in fact, largely the theory of institutional economics is resting on human beings who are not homo economicus. Because you see, new institutional economics rests on social norms. Social norms are essentially a product of human behavior, and this behavior is not necessarily driven by wealth maximization, let's say. In fact, the problem with neoclassical economic theory is that it is so deep-rooted in wealth maximization that it is unable to explain the diverging patterns of economies around the world. And just when you start explaining divergent economies, why are some countries rich and the other countries poor, neoclassical economic theory is so sterile because it fails to explain the incentive structure imposed by informal institutions. So yeah, perfect. I perfectly agree. There is no reason for anyone to assume that behavioral economics does not play an important role. In fact, indeed it does, and that is what I'm talking about. It will. The example that I gave you was about the shopping was definitely specifically in that. Yes.
I think I will commend you for the wonderful presentation. I believe that some of us coming from the Commonwealth countries who suffered the imperialism of these British might have the same story as you are saying. But you were talking about the people resorting to informal institutions, like legal institutions, rather than the formal ones because you think they are cheaper.
Right.
Don't you think it is because they don't understand the system? Because we know all these institutions were just institutions that were imposed. And as you started your development, we got to know that we had our own, I'm saying we because I'm also sharing your view. You know, we had our own system of government, we had our own system of administration and all those things. And it seems all these things, legal things, in quotes, were things that were imposed on us. So more or less, I think the people are resorting to the other forms of legal institutions, that is the informal ones, not just because they are cheaper, but because probably they don't understand.
So it's a very good point. The way transaction cost is defined incorporates in itself the search and the information cost. So how Ronald Coase, so when I'm saying they're cheaper, I'm basically talking about transaction cost. I hope that is clear. So transaction cost of following legal institutions is much more than transaction cost of following social norms. This transaction cost also includes the information cost or understanding cost, the way you say. So obviously, when I'm the very term transaction cost incorporates the idea that you're proposing, so I am in perfect agreement. And what you're saying makes absolute sense. When you study Coase's article in 1960, which he wrote The Problem of Social Cost in Journal of Law and Economics, or maybe you should read it even before it is discussed in the class, that article and another article, Theory of the Firm in 1937, which he wrote. This article itself spoke about transaction cost, keeping in mind search cost, information cost, the cost of information asymmetry, which later on George Akerlof did. So that's perfectly understandable and is definitely fitting into the thesis.
Mine is more in the nature of a long comment. I understood your thesis, but I'm not quite sure the analysis follows the thesis or is a precursor to it, because there are quite a few issues.
I'm sure there will be. There's like,
Firstly, the importation of laws wholesale is not quite accurate. A lot of laws in India today reflect what the lawmakers thought the law in society should be or is, and then try to translate that into law.
So these lawmakers are all, can I enter? So yeah, so these lawmakers are all, so when you're saying lawmakers, you're basically referring to people who are, you're referring to the Constituent Assembly probably?
Not just.
Then?
I'm referring to laws that came after that as well.
After that?
By the first Indian Parliament, for instance,
Right.
and several others, which tried to, for example, the Hindu Marriages Act.
Right.
Several which try to translate both what law is and what law should be into the legal codes. So the wholesale importation of laws may have begun, but it did not really translate into laws as they stand in India today.
But how are you so sure that people who so-called knew what the law should be, actually knew what the law should be?
I am assuming as educated Indians who were the closest to understanding what law at any point could be, they had a better idea of it than the British.
Yeah, see, this is exactly.
I thought that was a fairly good reflection of what the direction they felt law should go in. Because informal institutions also have the problem of being plagued with several prejudices over centuries, and sometimes you need the intervention of law to sort them out.
So, 2 points. I absolutely agree that sometimes we definitely need a third party to construct laws because the informal institution may be inefficient, and that's perfectly understandable. And I agree. My point is, the laws that they should make should create institutions which are cheaper to transact in than more expensive to transact the other. That is one. Second, this is exactly that I have a problem with. When you assume that somebody sitting at the top of the pyramid would know that I think what the law should be in this country. Because, so I am not necessarily talking, or I am not necessarily agreeing to what Hayek said about how laws evolve in a spontaneous order manner. Friedrich Hayek, who is another Nobel Prize winner in economics, one of his strongest contribution to the whole idea of economics is this. He says that there is no supreme power in this world which can probably predict anything that the market would, anything better that the market would. So he says that the result in efficiency is a result of millions of transactions that take place in the market, and therefore a central planning agency, and that is why he was against the whole idea of planning, which was taking place during those days in the communist nations. That no central planner will ever have full information, and because full information is never existing, therefore whatever policies central planners will do will always have some unintended consequences, and that is also directly, I can extend the same logic, and that which is also done by many scholars, to laws. Law is also a result of spontaneous evolution. If you read the LLSV literature, which is a lot in late 1990s until now, a lot has been written. Why they say that common law is probably more efficient than civil law is because common law is a precedence-based law, and therefore it evolves over time. And it is only through evolution what Axelrod or I forget the name of another scholar, they say inefficient solution because of competition will always weed out, and the efficient solutions or efficient laws will always emerge. And so, although what you're saying makes absolute sense, that educated Indians, if I would call, so educated Indians know what law should be better for India, I still need to understand what is educated and what is better. My point is, they should make laws, but even when they make laws, they have to keep in mind, which they did not, the social institutions on which India is setting up. Obviously there are costs, and sometimes we want to bear those costs because we want to get rid of the negative connotations, negative consequences of social norms, which is where I agree. But I disagree in accepting that one central planner will know what law we should have. That's very normative assumption, but I don't want to be normative in this idea. This entire description that I'm giving is more or less positive in nature than normative in nature. But I would like to hear more.
If I may, my point was here simply that the people talking about the central planner was not one individual. It was a group of elected individuals from all over the country, which is the closest perhaps that you can get to having some sort of a representative democracy, which I believe that was there at that point in time. Secondly, I would disagree with you on the notion that the laws did not accurately reflect what the law should have been like. Because your return seems to be either to a sort of village republic anarchy, which I disagree with, and secondly to a sort of let's wait and figure out informal institutions and see what sort of result they best throw up, which is what I believe actually done.
I think you're taking the conclusion from the takeaway a bit too far. So what I'm envisaging is what you would understand as Panchayati Raj, right? What I am proposing is not a village level anarchy, but village level Panchayati Raj institution. Panchayati Raj institutions is a constitutional mandate in India where communities and villages have, so power is decentralized in villages and communities are given power to enact bylaws as well as adjudicate disputes that take place in those localities. These are a result of long-standing tradition of decentralized social structure that India always had. And this is the point that I'm trying to make. That decentralized social structure was undermined while making overarching laws. Secondly, I give due credit to many laws that exist which have indeed helped India to reach where it has reached compared to what we were. Today we have 74% literacy compared to 12% when we were independent, and obviously it wouldn't have been possible if it was not for the legal institutions that we have. So I am in no way trying to propose that whatever we did with the constitution was absolutely bad. No way, no. There are a number of good things, but we cannot expect to reap all the benefits of capitalism unless we ingrain into our models the institutions which are informal in nature, or alternatively, we have to understand institutions in order for us to develop institutions. So I am saying institutional changes take place, and this is what North has also said, and I'm sorry for being a little longer, but let me explain this because I did not. Institutional change is always incremental, it is always glacial in pace, it's very slow, and it is always marginal. Institutions do change across a period of time, and they have always changed in all societies. The point is we have to realize and we have to try to locate and identify where do they change and how do they change. Education is probably one way by way of which we change institutions. So the impetus on caste today is less than the impetus on caste, let's say during independence. This is a result of education. So India probably needs to invest more in education so as to increase the pace of institutional change. What India is practically doing is it is investing in hard sciences education, so you have more engineers coming out, than in soft sciences education, so you have less sociology, philosophy, or political science, or even lawyers coming out. India has around 900 law colleges in 900.
1,000 actually.
Around 1,000. Well, yeah, and close. And if I ask you, you would not be able to name more than 50. Right? So that's the kind of, so in education probably.
I can't name more than 15 engineering colleges either.
Yeah,
and my point is, we talk about Panchayati Raj institutions. So when you look at the class, there's something called Khap Panchayats, which are extremely controversial in India right now. They involve village panchayats, panchayats being the group of the wise men of the village deciding. These Khap Panchayats are extremely regressive because they are caste panchayats, and they tend to decide, and they have been extremely retrograde in the kind of decisions they're given, and their word is law. So my problem again, when it comes to taking the best practice norms, I would agree. But when it comes to regressing to the village republic Panchayati Raj, I would have problems because they are perpetuating stereotypes and prejudices. Absolutely.
No, Khap Panchayat is an extremely derogatory way in which an institution can evolve, and I agree. And this is exactly where you need a third party enforcement. So this is where you draw the line. But overall, Khap Panchayats are a result. So it's like this. Why do Khap Panchayats exist? It's because of some social structure that India has lived through in the last 2.5 centuries. And those social institutions are ingrained in the informal institutions. So let us first try to understand informal institution, and only then can we probably hope to alter the progress in the manner that we expect it to be. So for example, if we don't want Khap Panchayats, we want a new institution, we first have to understand the institution on which it is based in the first place. And that is my thesis. So what I am emphasizing is, let us try to understand institutions before making policies. So we can come up with a policy of banning all Khap Panchayats, but then it will always, and it was, in fact, faced with a lot of criticism amongst village communities themselves. Any popular party in power will not do it because they want votes. And so therefore, in order to do it, a long-term solution can be sought after. But you can look at long-term solution only when you look at how this emerged in the first place. It emerged from the informal institution. So all I am trying to sensitize you all is to not to undermine the importance of informal institution in the development and growth context. That is what I am trying to make you sensitize. We definitely need third-party laws. We need an enforcement from a strong centralized authority like state, because obviously many informal institutions will be inefficient. I mean, David, he wrote a paper in 1988, Clio and the Economics of Poverty. You know, poverty keypad, QWERTY, that's science. Scientifically, that is not the most efficient way to organize, if you want to type in English, that's not the most efficient way of arranging the letters on the keypad. However, the whole world still uses it. The reason is, it is logged in history. Because somebody started it, because the whole world started using it, now we use it. And there are many other examples like that. Institutions are therefore logged in history. Unless you unlock them in history, you cannot expect to create policies that change them. That is what I am trying to sensitize you. You do need to change institutions, formal, informal, both. And I am not saying that informal institutions are good. I am not trying to propose that informal institutions are the solution to society. No way at all. All I am saying is, unless you understand informal institutions, understanding informal institutions doesn't make sense. That's the idea. And this is something which has largely been neglected for far too long for purely our segmentary and watertight studies. So somebody who's studying law will study law, somebody who's studying political science will study political science. it is very important for us to be interdisciplinary in nature so that we cross-navigate between history, anthropology, political science, philosophy, economics and law. And unless we do it, we will not get the whole holistic picture. Political scientists will talk about their own theories out there in a group, and lawyers will talk about their theories out here in a group. And that is what I want to sensitize. You cannot do it unless you can, and you cannot study institutions unless you study it in an interdisciplinary fashion.
I've just got a comment as well, and not specifically on India because I probably don't know enough about it, but what I thought was interesting with looking at formal and informal institutions and two sets of laws is if we look at, and again it's a gross generalisation, but I think if we look at a lot of law schools and who ends up going to law school, and often those are people who might contribute to framing the law and the more formal set of laws, I think in a lot of places, like a law school class might not be representative of society as a whole, in the sense that along the way you might have lack of access to education, or perhaps someone who's given more opportunities than another person on a systemic basis, or than another group of people. And in that sense, I think it's also really useful to look at informal institutions, because just within one country, you don't necessarily all share the same informal institutions. And again, within one group of people.
No,
I just thought that was interesting.
No, thanks.
I don't know if it applies to India.
Absolutely.
What's informal institutions mean is that the informal institution makes the final product or just make parts of the product for a big company or legal institution.
Well, by informal institution, I mean anything that is not written, that is followed as a common practice. So I speak a particular language because this is the language I evolved through. Hearing this language, I evolved through hearing this language. So let's say I speak a particular language, that's an informal institution. I greet my elders in a particular manner, that's an informal institution. I probably get married in a particular. So informal institutions are rules which human beings have created in order to lend certainty to their transactions. So this is how things will take place, but they have not been codified as such, or they have not been imposed by a third party. So institutions that have evolved over a period of time. So let's say, for example, even animals, they evolve certain institutions so as to understand, if you look at higher order animals like chimpanzees. The institutions that I'm trying to propose here is rules, regulations and constraints that human beings have evolved in order to guide and lend more certainty to their own transactions. And that's as simple as this. Any law probably is an institution. If that law is a result of custom, it's informal in nature. If that law is a result of a statute, it's formal in nature. That's the differentiation.
But if the scope is big enough, it is impossible to be illegal or informal for a long time.
I'm sorry, it's impossible?
If the scope of the informal institution is big enough, that is impossible to be illegal for a long time. That is illegal forever.
It is impossible to be illegal for a long time?
Yeah.
Give me an example. How do you think so?
If you have a company that is 1,000 employees work for it, that's all the government wants regulation. You mean that your informal institution is just formally the family members that are working?
Family members or community members?
Yeah. That is small scope of that.
Oh yes, yes. So that's how you define scope. Yes, entirely. It has a smaller scope. But imagine a society which has millions of such communities having their several social norms. Obviously, transacting with such society is going to be very costly, and therefore you need a third-party intervention so as to lend a certainty in the transaction of all society. So I agree. However, if you look at the scope of informal institution against formal legal institutions, it will always be small, because formal legal institutions are designed in the first place so as to broaden the scope of institutions. I want to transact with an Italian. I don't care whether he's coming from Sicily or from Rome or Naples. I want to know what is the Italian law, and that's about it. If there is no Italian law, then maybe Sicily has developed their own norms. Traders in northern Italy have developed their own norms, and I have to follow their norms. That makes it very, very expensive for me to transact with them. So scope of formal, and that is the whole point of why formal institutions are taking place. My point is that these formal institutions should aid to the development of the society, and that sometimes doesn't happen because they, anyways, I don't want to repeat whatever I just said. So yeah, I perfectly agree with that.
And just you mentioned about social development. Do you mean lowering transaction cost? You said by social development, lowering transaction costs and getting rid of information asymmetry?
Okay, so that's a good question. Lowering transaction cost. So okay, let me rephrase this. Lowering, or let me rephrase what I had in mind. Lowering transaction cost increases efficiency, right? That's what the standard neoclassical paradigm is. Increase of efficiency will increase productivity, and increase of productivity will increase growth, right? Now this was a small little discussion that I was having with Sakhin just before this lecture. This growth may not necessarily be 100% correlated with development. And if I define development as how Amartya Sen defines it, growth and development are two separate entities. From economics point of view, if I say that this development is purely economic in nature and this is economic development, obviously reducing transaction cost increases efficiency, increases productivity, and it increases growth, and therefore it increases economic development. It may not increase social development, and this is exactly what the case in India is, by and large, to a large extent. So case in India is, we have an economic development taking place, which is a very high GDP growth rate, but the development of the society is not taking place at the same proportion or at the same pace. We have a huge amount of poverty, malnourishment still existing, while this whole group. So if I'm talking about social development, the transaction cost is not the only determinant or not the only benchmark by way of which I can.
First of all, I think the system cannot do without either of these propositions, the legal or the informal sector. And I think it's a case of adaptability. How the legal, how the legal laws can be adapted to informal norms.
That's a fantastic point.
And yeah, I'll support my argument with three short scenarios. First of all, I will start with the hot tax war. It's HUT as in hot, thatch houses, and Sierra Leone. When the British came to Sierra Leone, they imposed a law on the locals that they should pay taxes for their homes. And then there was a king warrior who said, come on, this is ridiculous. We allow you to come to our homeland and stay for free. We're paying rights to our kings, and now you're tasking us because of the houses we built ourselves. And it's our land. Why should we pay you? And so they revolted. His name was Baiboe. Baiboe revolted against the British, and he fought them until he was betrayed by some of his kinsmen. And the idea was, they thought taxation was alien as the British presented it. But subconsciously or unknowingly, they were paying tax in the form of tithes to their kings. Right. But because they thought taxation from the British perspective was alien, they deviated. That is one case. Secondly, I will reference a book that was written by Ghanaian titled The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. Beauty in this case doesn't refer to physical beauty, but it means people who make the change. For this book, he was exiled from Ghana. And there was a particular paragraph in which he said, a man who was a man also, who worked for a timber company, was so corrupt that he became very rich in his town. And nobody cared about his corruption. People thought he was the hero and everybody liked and loved him. One of the employees chose to prosecute him, and he became the public enemy. So instead of becoming the hero, he became the public enemy. That was because of the informal.
This is the case in Indian villages.
That was because of the informal construct. Yes. People think you should be a brother's keeper, whether it's negatively or positively. That is the second case. And now I'll move on to a success story. And see, when we had the HIV epidemic, there was issues of campaigns. Certain communities were rejecting sex education because it was contrary to their religious and cultural norms, Islam in particular. And it took the government so much time to pass legislation and that sex education should be included in every school curriculum. It was to no avail. It never succeeded legally. Not until they decided, well, we should go back to the community leaders, go back to the religious leaders and see how we can get around this. And now, before that time, people interpreted religious rules like in the Quran differently, because they never thought of a situation wherein you would have to give sex education in an open and broad manner. Yeah. But in fact, in the Quran or other religious doctrine, it is supported somehow. So most of the intellectual religious leaders look into the Quran and say, there is a clause that said, every man or woman has the right to education. It's in the Quran. It's like, Talabul ilmi faridatu. It's compulsory for every man or woman to seek education. And so they said, sex education, this is education. And we need it because our welfare and our well-being depends on it. So after all, Islam did support this one. And so from that perspective, they began to preach this to the people. And it took less than a month or two for everyone to accept sex education. And then it became a success. So even though in the short run, it was costly to get around this, but I think the conformity and long-run benefit was enough to offset the short run. Right. So I think the whole idea is how we can adapt the legal laws to suit, the informal norms. And you should bear in mind that people resent, legal laws because they think, to start with, it's favored the villages more than the locals. I'll give you an example. In the educational sector in my country, initially all you could study was languages or theology. That was because in commerce, the villages needed people who can serve as translators. It's aided there. So all what was available to you was theology or language studies. And they also needed people who can propagate their religion, Christianity. And they never focused on technology as an educational field in Africa initially. Because they thought we never needed development. They needed it, they needed for their revolution. All we needed was translators and pastors.
There's a study that, I forget the name of the scholar who's doing his PhD in NYU. He's studying how Europeans divided West Africa in straight lines, right? In straight line fashions. And so these straight lines sometimes crisscrossed the community that is living both on the right and on the left of the straight line. So this community has the same informal institution of how property laws or property rights are evolved in that society. Now because there are two different countries, they have different laws entirely. So formal institutions are entirely different compared to informal institutions. The laws, and so he has done an empirical study over a period of time, and he has seen that the disjoint between formal and informal institutions is creating more chaos in terms of creating more inefficiency in those societies. So it's a very interesting example because very difficult you find such real examples where you have same informal institutions but different formal institutions. And regarding the point on adaptive efficiency, it's a fantastic one which I deliberately did not bring because it's a long discussion. North mentions in his study that one of the ways by which incremental change in institutions take place is on the basis of adaptive efficiency. And adaptive efficiency is a subset of the social structure as such, in which particularly important is education. And that is one takeaway which I am building is one reason by way of which we can probably change the informal institutions, inefficient institution, is by investing more in education. And education in soft sciences, which have higher social benefit but lower private benefit. And this idea comes from Aristotle, long. So yeah, thanks for enlightening me in that class about. They're like very common problems. Similar problems have happened in India as well, particularly in the East between 50s and 60s. But yeah, thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you very much. Like I first said, I believe that if we want to go beyond these problems, then it is better for us to stop hiding behind the cloak of education and just hit the nail on its head. I believe that there are certain sort of institutions that needs to be shaping in a way that people living in such countries will understand. Because much of these chaos in the countries you are talking about are just as a result of the fact that they don't understand. It is not part of them. You understand? So if we want to solve this problem, maybe we can talk about still enforcing those laws. But I believe that there are certain institutions that need to be withheld. If I don't
let me reiterate this point. I am not proposing. In no way I am meaning to propose that informal institutions are better than formal institutions. No way. No. All I am saying is, in order to understand where we are, we have to understand how we have been. And far too long, we have ignored, particularly political scientists and students who study economics and law have ignored the importance of economic history in understanding the problems. And just when you understand the problems, you realize the solutions are much easier to theorize and implement. Very simply stated, this comes from the idea of institutional economics. I also feel that institutional economics is something that you will study in the course of your LLM or MSc here. And when you do it, and if there was something that you get out of this lecture, you may want to import this theory or idea into your own country. And that is the whole purpose. Different countries will have, so again, as I said, I'm building turtles over turtles. There will be some turtles missing in between. And I need more turtles probably to come under. But no theoretical analysis of divergent economies around the world is possible without studying institutions. And the reason institutions has now gained so much of importance, I mean, this year's Nobel Prize in Economics has gone to macroeconomists. Last year's, Ostroms and Williamson, they both were institutional economists. Eleanor Ostrom, who's working on the Commons project, which is an important project for you all to study here as well, talks about informal institutions, how communities have evolved property rights systems amongst themselves, and how, so for example, in Botswana, the elephants are property of the tribals. In Kenya, it is illegal for you to poach elephants. In Botswana, you can, as long as the tribals give you the permission. And the number of elephants is dwindling in Kenya, whereas it has increased in Botswana, where you can poach. The idea is, see, for example, cows, chicken, or I don't know, these animals will never go extinct because, okay, anyways, I'm digressing too much towards property rights. But impression is, we need to understand institutions. I have just 4 slides, so I want to sort of summarize the whole thing that I discussed. I gave you the picture of India, in which I want to focus on this one particularly. Religious affiliation, even today, govern creation and protection of rent, the acquisition of skills and contacts, the rationing of finance, the establishment and defense of collective reputation, circulation of information, and norms that regulate inheritance and management of property. In India, businesses are unlike this even today. Unless we understand this, we will not be able to facilitate businesses that help bring the people who are entangled in the pockets of poverty in various parts and most parts of the country. So that's an important thing. Almost half the firms in India are caste homogeneous. We have poor contract enforcement, diluted rule of law society, illiteracy. I discussed about corruption. I discussed about inability to concentrate strong political power. Then I talked about institutions. I began from how divergent societies around the world is a result of incentive structures which is modeled in institutions. Institutions could be, as I said, formal, informal, creative, evolutionary. I did not discuss in detail about efficiency because it will take a few weeks before you understand the concept of efficiency from law and economics perspective, and that is when probably this will be more appealing. And why institutions are logged in, and why this feedback system, what you talked about, information that people don't even know. This feedback system is important. Finally, I try to connect the dots, particularly with respect to the history of India, but such a study is perfectly possible for any other country. And I discussed the way in which Indian societies develop. Most of this historical representation focuses on India before Britishers came. Okay. It will be entirely a different study as to how the cross juxtaposition of institutions while Britishers were here took place over the course of 200 years. So I have deliberately excluded it. However, I still emphasize that even Britishers were not able to root out majority of social institutions at the bottom of the pyramid, which is by far the largest. In my case here, there were some authors that I discussed. So on discussion of what India looks like today, I refer to LLSC literature. LLSC is this Laporter, Schleifer and Vishni's combined research study that was published in a number of papers and a number of articles in different journals, which models how law and finance are correlated. So what these guys did was, there was a huge bunch of they had around 20 to 30 research associates who would simply do regression models on how particular country, the underlying premise is common law is more efficient than civil law. And this is a big statement that they made. But they did a lot of quantitative study on various countries, including India. World Bank has done it. Institutional analysis comes from these authors. I'm not given their particular articles. And historical and political science representation and illustrations mainly came from. This is in the order of the importance of the authors that I used. Is there anything else I'd be happy to answer, or you can always get in touch with me through emails?
Thank you.